I had been in the booth for hours. The padded walls swallowing every trace of the outside world until it felt as though I had been entombed in some carefully upholstered coffin. The air inside was warm and stale from my own breath, and smelled faintly of the synthetic foam that lined every surface. A halo of light spilled from the narrow lamp above my copy stand, turning the pages before me into a pool of brightness surrounded by impenetrable shadow. When the email from the client came through that morning, there had been no preamble, no subject line or signature, just a single attachment. The file bore no author's name, no publisher's watermark, and no title beyond manuscript.pdf. I assumed it had been forwarded to me in error. Such things happen often enough in freelance narration, but curiosity is a stubborn itch, and before I could stop myself, I had downloaded it, printed it, and carried it into my booth. The first page was harmless enough, a fragment of what seemed to be a short story. The language was stiff and inelegant, as though translated twice from some other tongue. But there was a certain rhythm to it that kept me reading aloud. I am a voice actor by trade, not an editor, after all. My task is not to question the quality of the words, but to breathe life into them. I pressed the record button and began. I had only reached the third paragraph when something peculiar happened. I turned the page expecting the next section and found only a single sentence at the top of the page. I was certain I had printed the entire document, double-faced with every other page left blank, but as I thumbed through it, every page was blank save for that second page with the single sentence on top. I told myself I had simply overlooked it, that somehow I screwed up the printing. My schedule was tight, as always, and I couldn't really afford the indulgence of superstition. So I continued reading, and as I read, the words continued to arrive, as though my act of speaking had summoned them into being. And stranger still, the prose had changed. No longer the stilted, vague narration of the opening. It now carried a keen specificity. It described in almost photographic detail the exact state of my recording booth. The worn crease in the corner of the copy stand where my elbow rested, the faint flecks of dust drifting lazily through the beam of the lamp, the pale reflection of my own face in the glass of the pop filter. My throat tightened, and I kept my voice even, steady. Years of practice smoothing over the unease curling in my stomach. And the words continued to arrive, a sentence or two at a time, never spilling onto the page until the moment I reached them in my narration. On the fourth page, the script began describing my movements in real time. The slow flex of my fingers as I adjusted the script, the subtle shift in my breathing when the room seemed too warm, the minute hesitation before I pronounced certain words. At one point, it mentioned the way my tongue caught briefly on the edge of a molar, a tiny, private imperfection in my speech I had never voiced aloud. I should have stopped. I should have stepped out of the booth, closed the door, and pretended this file had never arrived. But the compulsion to continue was stronger than caution, stronger than fear. The words did not merely want to be read. They demanded it. By the seventh page, the descriptions were no longer passive observations. They were instructions. Subtle at first. Lower your voice here, pause longer before this sentence. Then more direct. Lean closer to the microphone. Rest your free hand against the wall. I obeyed them without thinking, as though the act of resistance would rupture some fragile pact between myself and the unseen hand guiding the script. The air in the booth had grown heavier warmer, as though someone else were in the small space with me, breathing in rhythm with me. I became acutely aware of the narrowness of the room, the claustrophobic proximity of the padded walls, the way the ceiling seemed to slope down toward my head. I could hear the faint thud of my own heartbeat in my ears, and under it, something softer, a sound like paper being turned somewhere behind me. Page 10 told me to read faster. Page 11 told me not to blink. Page 12 told me to open my mouth wider, to let the words flow more easily, to ignore the ache creeping into my jaw. When I reached page 13, the text began to speak directly to me. It knew my name. It recounted in past tense the exact sequence of my morning. The bitter coffee, the shower that never fully warmed, the moment I sat down at my desk and saw the message arrive, and then it began to describe events that had not yet happened. You will finish this story. You will not leave this booth until the final page is read. I turned the page and saw nothing. Blank paper. My pulse hammered in my ears, and then as my mouth opened to speak the silence, the words bled onto the page in a thin, inky stream, forming each letter just ahead of my gaze, racing to stay in front of my voice. The story was almost over now. It described how I sat hunched in the narrow light, how my fingers trembled as they gripped the paper, how something loomed just beyond my peripheral vision, waiting for me to reach that final sentence. My breath caught, and the page told me to keep reading and not to turn around.